linked, and we have joint interests and aspirations, I guess.
Indeed, that is absolutely true. And I want to just take a moment to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I normally see, here we go, under the chat, if anyone wants to let us know where they're joining us from and share. It's always nice to say, oh, someone's from Argentina, California. So please feel free to do that. I see someone's got a raised hand. Is that right? Clarenza, nice to see you, Clarenza. I know she's joining us from Italy. And if anyone wants to, just a little bit of housekeeping, if anyone wants to make a comment, they're welcome to do that in the chat or to in the Q&A. And just make sure if you're doing it in the chat, because by default, for some reason, it only sends messages to hosts and panelists. If you want everyone to see it, then you need to make sure that everyone is listed as in the two. And oh, the chat is disabled for some reason, according to my colleague Emma. So I do not know why that should be. I wondered why I wasn't seeing any chat. I normally do. I don't know if I can. Panelists can chat with hosts and panelists. Attendees can chat with no one. Aha, maybe this is a new Zoom setting. Attendees can chat with everyone and panelists can chat with everyone. Now we should be cooking. Let's see, can someone test chat to see if it's now working? Hey, there we go.
Wow, very good.
So from DC and from Cork and from Stockholm.
Oh, wow.
There you go. See,
what reach you have. Very good. Yeah.
Patricia's from the US, I believe, and Heather's from Denver. So there you go, Chicago, represent. And I am joining you from the UK, from Hastings. And Simon, you're in the UK as well, right?
No, I'm in Milan. I'm in Milan.
Oh, that's right, you're in Milan.
Yeah.
I can't believe I forgot.
I was in the UK when we last spoke, but I'm based in Milan, yes.
Right, where I'm going to be next week, speaking at the World Art Foundation conference. Yeah. So that's going to be fun, and you should send me any restaurant recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm looking forward to it. And so also, hey, if you have any clients you think would be interested in ArtEvolve, let me know. And I see we've got people here from Germany and Los Angeles. And yeah, so welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see you, sort of, and be with you here. And hello from Boston as well. You know, I used to live in Boston when I was 20. That was my first adult town, Boston. So thank you so much for joining us, Simon. And let me introduce you properly with all of your titles and credentials. So Simon Craig, fine art loss adjuster and risk surveyor, founder of Untitled 1960. So, and I, for anyone who is in doubt, am Annika Eriksson, and I am the founder and CEO of ArtEvolve. And we are pleased to bring to you this afternoon a ArtEvolve series on how technology is transforming art insurance, which, yes, is, as I said at the top, a subject which is near and dear to many of our hearts, insurance, and how to navigate it successfully. So, so thank you so much for joining us, Simon. And please, can you start by telling us a little bit more about yourself and your company?
Yes, well, firstly, Annika, thank you very much for the kind invitation. ArtEvolve is a product I've been aware of for some time now. And so to have the opportunity to be part of your journey is very much welcomed. So my background generally is my working life. I started as an articled clerk in a solicitor's office, provisional solicitor's office in the UK. Decided very quickly that I really didn't want to be a lawyer badly enough to go through the qualification process, so changed tack somewhat, joined Norwich Union Insurance Company, but dealing with liability issues, so my interest in the law was maintained. So I worked for the Norwich Union in the north of England for some years before then switching over to loss adjusting. So in the UK, I deal mainly with large industrial risks in the north of England, agricultural losses, livestock, property. And then due to a change in circumstances and having been to Lake Garda in Italy for windsurfing holidays, 4 years on the trot, an ideal opportunity came along and I received a job offer in Milan as a loss adjuster. So I moved to Milan in 1991. And the work I deal with in Italy changed, obviously. So other than the jewelry trade, manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, etc., quickly became involved in fine art, which I hadn't really dealt with in the UK other than in the context of high net worth risks. And so the learning curve was quite steep. But as I say, I came to Italy in 91. So I've been dealing with fine art claims for the best part of 30 years. Set up our own company in 97, General Adjusting. And then a few years ago, I reached my mid-50s. There's quite a lot of politics involved in Italy. I decided I'd had enough of that, and I was lucky enough to have somebody to pass the general side of the business on to, my son. And so 5 years ago, I set up Untitled, 1960. And so nowadays I deal only with high net worth, ultra high net worth, musical instruments, classic and historic motorsport cars, and fine art. Fine art is a passion. The people I see are very interesting. I get to see risks and locations that nobody else will see. A very good example was the Vatican a few years ago. I had to survey the collection of Pope mobiles to be insured by Lloyd's, which was very, very interesting. And so on the fine art side, I work in two ways. Firstly, from the pre-risk aspect, before an underwriter agrees to insure a piece of art. So that can involve checking provenance, value, condition, etc. And then once a policy has been issued, I then handle the claims for underwriters. I work mainly for insurers, but also some financial institutions, galleries, and private collectors. But I'd say mainly insurers.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. That is a interesting journey you've been on, and a neat kind of claim to fame with the Pope mobiles. I got to hold the single lens microscope that Sir Isaac Newton made for himself at the Royal Society. That's one of my claim to fames for my career. So it's nice. I mean, that's really why I got into conservation and collection care, was to have that kind of intimate relationship with really fantastic and interesting objects. So it's a good perk, which I'm sure many people here with us in this virtual room share and have some good stories. Someday we should have a claim to fame ArtEvolve party where we share our good stuff. So now I have a few questions here I'm just going to refer to so I don't get too off topic. So what are some of the general issues currently faced by art world professionals relating to insurance? So let's identify some of the challenges that technology can help solve. And what are also some examples that you have seen? And how has your practice evolved to meet the challenges that you face with technology?
Okay, well, I think I think everyone is conscious of evolving technology and how quickly it's developed in recent years, and how this may be relevant to the art world, whatever your role or function.
Mhm.
So developments of late, examples include NFTs.
Mhm.
One of the issues, I think, for the insurance industry is an NFT a fine art risk, or is it a cyber risk? So an NFT cannot sustain physical damage. It doesn't need restoring, but
Mhm.
of course it can be corrupted through hacking.
Yeah.
Um, you can have sleep minting, whereby an artist's work is faked essentially and sold and traded. You can have hacking of works that are held to ransom. And so I think the tendency in the insurance industry is to regard them predominantly as cyber risks
Mhm.
rather than fine art risks. Another development is GPS technology,
Mhm.
where trackers can be configured to immediately notify interested parties of not only unauthorized movement, but to alert extremes of heat and cold, um,
Absolutely. Yeah,
which
we
clearly
incorporate.
can be very important in safeguarding art whilst either in storage, especially if the storage conditions are subject to unexpected fluctuation, or in exhibition venues. Um,
Or transit. I mean, we
or
are
well,
partnered with the
interestingly, the technology nowadays is such that the GPS trackers are so small they can be incorporated in art in a very discreet way, such that thieves would not know that there is a GPS tracker. So,
Mhm.
not infrequently, GPS tracker technology can result not only in recovery of the artwork, but apprehension of the thieves,
Mhm.
which is clearly of relevance. Blockchain technology is another emerging development that continues to grow.
Yeah.
Um, in the context of condition reports, they can be uploaded to ensure secure safekeeping of a unalterable document, um,
Absolutely.
and which is relevant to the provenance of an object, amongst other things. Although I'm not personally aware of a working platform, in principle, other documentation that you can maintain on blockchain, you could have evidence of acquisition, valuations, the conservation history, the exhibition history,
Well,
the insurance cycle. So the insurance cycle is very pertinent, because on the platform you could have copies of the proposal form or the policy questionnaire,
mhm.
any pre-risk security survey, the
Yeah.
policy document itself, claims documentation, restorers reports, condition reports, treatment proposals, invoices, documents of transport, loan agreements, loss adjusters reports, photographs. I mean, you could go on and on.
Yeah.
A good example is, I think, recent collaboration between Christie's and a French antiques dealer, whereby objects sold at auction by Christie's will be registered and secured on a blockchain through an outfit called Artery. Artery is an art tech firm that
I know
specializes
them.
in blockchain. Yeah.
I know them well, and in fact, I was just going to say that I am a member of the same. We're a member of a consortium which is called the Artwork Identification Standard.
Okay.
The purpose of that consortium, of which I'm on the executive committee and the co-lead of the technical working group,
Hmm.
is to basically create what you're talking about.
Hmm.
A space where all of those things, all of those kinds of data points can be present,
Yeah.
and to create a shared economy, and to do that via initially an identifier, which is a unique identifier for all art and cultural objects globally, which would serve as a kind of a beacon and something akin to an ISBN number, right? And we actually have an ArtEvolve an ArtEvolve, which is dedicated to this topic. So if anyone's interested to learn more, they can go check our website to the Learn More space, where we have recordings of previous ArtEvolves on there. And there is one about that. And I see actually in the audience, we have Nicholas Eastaugh, who is another member of this consortium, and also even Simon Hornby too, and Crozier are also members of the consortium. So
Hi,
it's
Nicholas. Yes.
in the works. We are building this thing, and it's going to take a while because we're talking about a whole infrastructure project for future-proofing the whole art market. So it's a pretty big deal, but we are working on that. And so Articheck, and for our part, will be contributing to that by providing our customers with the option to be content providers for that space. And of course, we will have payment gateways and privacy rules and all that kind of stuff, so that they can pick and choose what information they wish to share under what circumstances.
Yeah, yeah. I think from insurers' perspective, generally insurers are nowadays especially constantly looking for ways to better manage risks. In my capacity as a loss adjuster, I can't remember the number of art objects I've seen in the context of a claim where there are pre-existing defects that underwriters were never aware of, because the art just wasn't checked properly before it was insured. And so what I think I'm finding nowadays increasingly is that underwriters, when they're looking at objects that are possibly particularly vulnerable to damage in transit, or in relation to large collections with high sums insured being consigned to exhibitions and fairs, they're now realizing the value of using condition reports as an underwriting tool before they agree to insure. And yes, it costs them money to obtain those, even though Articheck is very cost effective, but it's an upfront investment that will pay dividends by virtue of the fact that they are potentially avoiding large claims involving pre-existing defects and all of the problems that are associated with that. And I think there's more of a willingness by underwriters to invest in these condition reports before insuring.
Absolutely. And let me just add to that, that it's not just a hypothetical anymore, because I don't know if I can name them because I don't think I have permission, but a major insurer has recently done analysis and found that Articheck customers have a lower loss ratio than average. So they categorically have, we can state now, there is proof and evidence that you can avoid damage by using Articheck, and I guess that is because of clarity, an enhancement of documentation and clarity and communication, as you say, identifying pre-existing issues, and also better communication on maintenance and art handling and transactions and all of these kinds of things.
Yeah. I think from the adjuster's perspective, as I say, just going back to the possibility of there being pre-existing defects or maybe indicators of prior restoration, it can be difficult for the adjuster to convince the owner of the object or the lending party, who in reality is sometimes quite cognizant of the fact that there is a pre-existing defect, but they won't readily acknowledge that necessarily, and they may maintain it's fresh damage. So from my perspective as an adjuster, it's easier with perhaps older works and long-standing states of condition, but not always. But usually it's time-consuming, and it's expensive for insurers to pay people to investigate that. And of course, condition reports obtained prior to the transportation process or entrustments is a good way to draw a line in the sand. It's not so easy in the case of contemporary art, especially with, for example, recent scratches which don't significantly predate the transportation process. But there again, with condition reports, if there's a scratch, it's going to be noted. So the value is there. I think in many cases, the owner or the lending party is genuinely unaware of the fact that there was a pre-existing defect or evidence of restoration. But it's important for me as a service provider, acting on behalf of insurers, to manage client expectations. And if they're not managed adequately, you can quite often see loss of goodwill, even if in the fullness of time you can demonstrate that it's old damage. And so this is, I think, particularly relevant not only to insurers when handling claims, but also to museums and galleries who themselves wish to maintain good relations with the owners and to secure future loans.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I know that the relationship between the borrower and the lender is a precarious one at times, and a highly valued one, and it's of kind of the utmost importance for the maintenance and nourishing of that relationship, as well as, of course, for service providers to their clients. So it can be a tricky business.
Yeah, and other than museums and galleries, there are other parties who have similar exposures. So, for example, shipping companies who store work, they have a similar exposure, a similar level of jeopardy. They really do have a need to protect their interests by producing a document that accurately indicates the condition of the work when it was entrusted, so that you can identify these pre-existing situations.
Well, and it's also good collection management practice to look at something every couple of years when it's in storage and make sure that everything still looks good.
Yeah. I think that the last question was, are there any other issues that are faced by the art insurance community? And they don't necessarily involve technology per se, but I think particularly of late, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, the volatility of economies and markets, political or regime change, global conflict, and natural disasters due to changing climatic conditions all impact on insurers' exposure, their willingness to insure, and the way in which they can handle claims. So there's a lot going on at the moment, other than developments in technology. But of course, the improvements in technology do serve to help underwriters significantly in coping with various of those challenges.
Absolutely. And I remember reading recently that some insurers have taken the decision recently not to renew policies, or at least to introduce higher deductibles and a requirement for a disaster plan in areas like Florida and California. So that's a new precedence, right? That because of natural disasters that we haven't, I don't think we've seen that before with insurers, have we?
No. Generally speaking, not. No, unless it was already a recognised zone subject to a higher incidence of loss involving climatic occurring events. But it is becoming increasingly relevant in today's environment.
Absolutely. And a lot of collectors moved to Florida over the pandemic, coincidentally. Right. So better get that disaster plan ready, I guess, you collectors.
Yeah.
So have you, I think that you were going to look at some examples from your archives of any particular stories that you wanted to share. I don't know if you had a chance to do that.
Well, yeah, there's a couple that spring to mind that I think have some relevance to what we're talking about.
Right.
So, for example, if we're looking at the medium of any particular object of art, there are some that are clearly more susceptible to damage during handling or transportation.
Mhm.
And so quite a good example, and I've had several of these, are claims involving works by Anselm Kiefer.
Oh
So,
yeah.
you know, I think perhaps quite a few people participating today would already be aware that he's well known for his large-scale works, big canvases with a very heavy impasto service, which frequently incorporate quite unusual materials, some metallic, being lead or steel or iron, others being organic materials such as straw or soil or clay. And he acknowledges that they will decay.
Hmm.
And the issue I find sometimes with works by Kiefer is that the canvases, given their large dimensions, are not always adequately supported by the stretcher frames. And so you get a lot of flex and movement of the canvas. And the combination of the weight of the heavy impasto together with the natural decaying process is such that you often get delamination
Mhm.
and heavy cracking, and you won't always be aware of that if you don't have a condition report.
Hmm.
And so in some cases these losses have been actually inevitable. They were just claims waiting to happen, which really is against the spirit of insurance.
I was
Insurance
going
is
to
to
say,
cover
I
you.
thought that
Yeah,
there was a provision for that with
yeah.
insurance.
Well, insurance is there to cover you for unforeseen, fortuitous events that are not expected, whereas claims falling in that category are somewhat inevitable. You do have specific exclusions in many fine art policies concerning pre-existing conditions or inherent defect, inherent vice. But in many cases, the delamination is not immediately apparent in the absence of a detailed condition report. What I find is that, with the best will in the world, some of the documentation prepared by fine art shippers is not sufficiently detailed to be construed as representing a condition report. It could be a collection note or a delivery note, and they
Well, I think
simply,
that's why a lot of shippers use the term artwork defect report, don't they?
yes, yeah.
And I think that it is fair to say that in the industry, you know, I think of it like, I always talk about it as a kind of a tiered system, partly because some of the pushback you get sometimes from dealers and gallerists is that they can't afford to have an independent conservator to do every condition report for every inventory item, for every movement that it makes, right? Nobody can. No one can afford that, right? And
No.
so I think that people should just like throw away that kind of expectation that anyone thinks that they can have an independent, you know, that the world's best leading conservator can do every report on everything that they're touching. But you can have reports done by independent, you know, actors, and there are, of course, different levels of expertise depending on who you choose. Shippers provide reports, as you say, and to different degrees of ability depending on the shipper that you're selecting. And of course, you know, you can do a condition report yourself as a dealer or a gallery or a seller or a loss adjuster or an artist, or you know, there's a lot of different actors within the industry who can do condition reports to varying degrees of expertise and ability and bias and, you know, experience and all the rest of it. And I think that the important thing is if you can, to kind of call that out. And that's one of the reasons that we have included in our system, the name and the title of the person examining, doing
Mm.
the examination. And
Yes. Yeah.
but I'm a firm believer that a condition report made by anyone is better than no condition report at all, and that a lot of people just don't do condition reports when they really probably should be.
Absolutely. And I think, pardon me, I think somebody with some basic training, armed with an ultraviolet light and a torch, can learn pretty quickly what to look for in preparing condition reports.
Mhm.
And if nothing else, if there's uncertainty, they can flag that. And if you're looking at high value objects, then by raising that flag, you're giving the owners or the insurers the opportunity to look more closely and perhaps then get in a qualified conservator or somebody with the
Absolutely.
requisite skill sets. So
Escalate. Yeah.
it's a tiered approach in some cases. But it's, I mean, I think the virtual courier product, for example, allowing video shots is also very useful, because there's a lot that actually maybe the person taking the video doesn't see that the viewer will. So again, it's a very useful interactive tool, I believe.
Thank you. And speaking of which, maybe you can talk a little bit. You told me in our preparatory call a bit about how you're now working with the Middle East and with loss adjusters on the ground there, because they don't have a lot of fine art specialist adjusters, and so you're having a kind of remote hybrid workflow that you're incorporating. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I think that's quite
Yes. So what we came to learn is that there is a finite number of specialist fine art adjusters working for the insurance industry. And with the ever increasing, it would seem, growth of large international fairs and new wealth, you find that there are geographic areas that are not within immediate reach of currently used fine art adjusters. So the option that underwriters have is to pay a loss adjuster to fly to, for example, the Middle East or Asia, to physically examine the work and adjust the claim. But that's time consuming and it's relatively expensive. And therefore, it's not cost effective for them to do that on the lower to medium value size claims. So they will be typically handled remotely and involve the adjuster requesting relevant photographs and documentation. But inevitably, you will get a degree of leakage on claims that are not properly controlled. And that's a trade-off for the underwriters who look at assumptions made concerning the level of leakage and how much, on the other hand, they've saved by not paying to send loss adjusters out on these low to medium value claims. So what I came to realize is that, and in this particular example, we have a relationship now with a very large firm of loss adjusters covering all of the Middle East. And so they have offices in 11, 12 different countries. And their adjusters are all qualified engineers. So they don't know anything about fine art. But by virtue of their technical background, they know a lot about materials. And actually, it's not difficult for a qualified professional with knowledge of materials to look at a piece of art that is a form of material with a view to identifying things that were not created by the artist. So defects that have arisen during the life of the work and that cannot be associated with the loss event as giving rise to claim.
Mm.
So the advantage for us as adjusters is that within 24, 36 hours of receiving an instruction, we have a pair of feet on the ground taking photographs with their smartphone or their tablet, preparing an Articheck condition report and sending that to me.
Mm.
And so it's very time efficient, it's extremely cost effective, and it enables insurers not only to control the perhaps higher volume, lower to medium value losses in order to control the leakage that I mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
but also to maintain good client relationships, because the process is so quick. And what I do think is, especially in today's fast track society that we all live in, there seems to be consistently increasingly high levels of expectation in respect of service standards, consumer rights, and I think anything insurers can do to not only provide an adequate service, but to excel in the service they provide, whilst at the same time saving money, is something that clearly must be of interest to them.
Sure. Well, I can say from my many conversations with insurers, especially over the pandemic, and especially with this large insurer that I mentioned earlier, doing this research, this analysis, I know that they are very much generally interested in the bottom line, because the top line doesn't have much of a place to go because everyone has insurance, and so what can they do? They can be more efficient. They can give loss adjusters one place where all the information exists, rather than them having to go look in 17 different places.
Yes.
Or they can ensure that things are better documented. And it's probably also worth mentioning that as far as I hear, both from insurers and from brokers, the market is changing a little bit, in that it is firming up a little, right? It's been a very soft market for quite some time.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's firming up. And so more and more insurers are requiring condition reports, for example, in situations where they might not have previously, just because they're getting a bit tougher in general on with their clients. And so I don't know if you have seen evidence of that in your work recently. Have you?
Yes, I have, and I think matters have sort of gained pace significantly as a result of the of the pandemic. So I think the use of Zoom and Teams calls opened a lot of people's eyes to what you could achieve remotely using that form of technology.
Yeah.
And at the same time, during the pandemic, due to the inability of people to travel, we noticed that insurers were asking us, whenever claims did come in the pandemic, and of course they dropped off significantly because you didn't have the movement of art, you didn't have fairs and exhibitions and what have you. But when they did come through, I think underwriters were looking increasingly for adjusters to handle claims remotely, what they call a desktop adjustment, by not actually looking at the piece of art. And so I think recent developments have given greater focus to the use of technology, and consideration of ways in which the use of that technology can enable insurers to give a better service and save money at the same time.
Well, so I have one more quick question or topic for discussion, and then I think we should open it up to the questions we have received from the audience. So, and that is, I think it is worth us quickly discussing sea freight and the new insurance guidelines that are coming out to do with sea freight. And again, I saw Simon in the audience, I'm in Hornby, who was on the working committee to develop these guidelines, I know. And so these guidelines, which were developed by this working committee working for the species committee, chaired by Chris Bentley from AXA, was around in response to the Gallery Climate Coalition, basically pressuring them to say, you know, we need sea freight to be happening more. We need to be sending work by sea much more often. It's like 95% lower carbon footprint. It's more affordable. We need to be doing it. And of course, insurers had their concerns around risk. And so they developed these guidelines to help us to address those concerns and risks. And those are going to be launched, I'm told, any day now. And so so that is an interesting industry change that we all need to try and facilitate in order to move to more sustainable practices. And I know that there are concerns by a lot of people about many aspects of this. And one aspect is, of course, the risk to the art, and you know, the difference of humidity and you know, other risks that might be associated with being at sea. And I know that in response to this, well, the guidelines, for one thing, have a checklist of things that you can do to try to ensure, you know, utmost safety, such as checking the inspection of the container to make sure that there's no holes in it, ensuring that it's locked and that you request it be below deck. Crozier have come out with art specialist containers, which Christie's have committed to filling 60% of for some period of time, so that other players in the art market can start to fill up the other 40% to try and, you know, make this thing happen. And we ArtEcheck have also baked in the guidelines into virtual courier sea freight, so that the checklist can be easily gone through by shippers, and you can document and demonstrate compliance to these guidelines through the platform, so that you have some evidence that they were followed should there be a claim. But you know, what are your thoughts about this whole move, and do you think that do you have any particular concerns around use of sea freight?
Well, yeah, as you say, Annika, the response of the Joint Species Committee of Lloyd's Market Association, so effectively Lloyd's, is a reaction to representations made by the art industry generally, and in particular the Gallery Climate Coalition. So the Gallery Climate Coalition is aimed at not only galleries, but other institutions, art fairs, artists, auction houses, etc. Anybody involved in the art industry.
Remember?
Yes. But I don't know. I don't wish to come across as being negative, but I think that sea freight should not be seen as a panacea for lower carbon footprints. It certainly contributes, it helps, but sea freight is still expensive and much slower than air freight.
Well, it's expensive now, but it wasn't.
Well,
so
yes, it is. Yes, and of course, at the moment, though, underwriters do typically charge increased premiums for sea freight, as it is considered to be inherently more hazardous. But of course, as you quite rightly say, you do get leading players such as Crozier's who are looking at steps they can take to make it less hazardous. I do feel, however, that there are other areas within the art industry that could contribute more to reducing carbon footprint. And a good example is collectors, VIPs, who travel to global art fairs using private jets.
That is a good
you know, that is a quick fix, really. And if you consider the reduced emissions that would be achieved compared to those that will be achieved by using sea freight. Well, yes, there is a lot to be looked at there, but I appreciate that the profile of a private collector is such that it might be difficult to persuade them to discontinue the use of their private jet.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to give a lot of people a lot of options, and
yes,
everyone has to decide what makes sense from their point of view for their lifestyle and their own world, and what they are comfortable with. So
yeah.
I think
I mean, the
some
other thing is,
collectors will be more
yeah,
comfortable with waiting for sea freight than they will for taking economy.
and I think they're just talking generally about fares post-pandemic. They've come back with a big bang.
Yeah.
There's a lot of movement now,
Mhm.
and another very simple example of doing something to reduce carbon footprint is to use recycled materials for packing and crating rather than single-use plastics.
Absolutely, that's an important one. And they're also looking at a lot of new kinds of biodegradable packing materials, mushroom packaging, all sorts of stuff. But of course, is it okay to use with art is another question. And so there's a lot of still research to be done. And one thing I want to mention too is Tyvek. I only found out recently that Tyvek is made by DuPont, which is the third largest polluting company in the world. So please, everybody, never use Tyvek again. Wow, I did not realize. I mean, it's used a lot in conservation packaging. Tyvek is, so that was a disappointment to learn. But you're right. I mean, there are certainly a lot of areas, and you traveling to the Middle East is a great example, or couriers traveling and doing more and more things remotely. Is a good way.
Very much. Yeah.
So I'm just conscious of the time, and I am going to look at some of the questions here in the Q&A bit. Here's one, which is from Dale Cronkite. Great name. Since all damage is a result of long-term fatigue of aging materials, outside of damage that occurs from a single catastrophic event, a drop, collision, fire, roof or plumbing failure, forklifts, etc., how can insurance companies evaluate the claim of flaking paints, buckles, blanching of paints, propagation cracks, etc., that are not the fault of a single organization or transport company or event, but rather the summary result of the treatment of the work of art over a long period of time? Good question, Dale. Tricky. And Simon, how do you say to that?
Well, you do have some specific exclusions in standard fine art wordings. So
wear and tear, is that
gradual deterioration, wear and tear, gradually operating causes. And so the challenge that the adjuster will face in looking at any given piece of art that's being claimed for is to differentiate between what is a gradually operating cause or a pre-existing defect as opposed to fresh damage. And so the purpose of the insurance cover, of course, is to protect the interested party against pecuniary loss, financial loss, resulting from damage caused during the life of the policy. And so that's why you have these standard exclusions. But here again, I would go back to my earlier comments that good, meaningful condition reports taken out prior to inception of the policy or prior to the insured transportation process are an extremely valuable tool to enable adjusters to distinguish between those two different categories.
Well, and also, I guess, one of the things that we talk a lot about with condition reports and their value is to intercept and escalate right before something travels. So for example, if you see that something has got some cracking with maybe raised edges before it's due to travel for a loan, you should really get that consolidated by a conservator before it goes, so that it doesn't, become worse and get exacerbated. So so yeah, it can be useful from that point of view. Now, I don't know if a insurer would pay for that consolidation, because that that I guess is not a, you know, extreme and single event, as you say, that has caused that in the first place. But so Patricia Loico, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, there seems to be no region in the world unaffected by natural disasters, i.e. ice storms in Texas. Yeah, that was pretty crazy. What is the insurance industry looking at to mitigate risk beforehand and deal with claims that may and do occur?
Well, underwriters do, and insurers, larger insurers, they do employ especially trained and qualified individuals to look at the preparation of models, climate models, disaster models, to highlight any areas that are subject to an increasing trend involving a growing incidence of natural disasters and the type of disaster, and to whether they would be regarded insurable at all, or if so, at what loaded premium. And I think sadly you find in increasingly there are many risks that are becoming uninsurable.
Well, I will say from my experience, because I was working at the Royal Horticultural Society when there was a flood, and there was not, this was like my first real conservation job many years ago, and there was not actually a disaster plan in place, and they had just had a refurbishment of their library, and it was in the basement, and it was very swish, and there was, you know, fire suppression system and all kinds of jazzy things, but some leaves in the gutters caused the leak to happen, and which was a shame. But it was luckily there wasn't a lot of loss, because we kind of just, you know, sprung into action and managed it fairly effectively, and we had Harwells, which we called in to do freezing of some of the rare books and things. But I think, you know, of course we got a disaster plan done after the disaster to make sure that in future we would be better prepared. And I think that is a really important tool that both insurers and, you know, collections care professionals need to make sure that they have a good disaster plan in place, right? And so, you know, that's something that we have been thinking about here at Articheck, about how we can support that and how we can have disaster plan templates in place, and, you know, recommendations, and help people with kind of on a consulting basis to help having a benchmark, you know, for how disaster plans are created, and gathering statistics also on disasters that happen, and in the disaster response, and in the outlying you know, dealing with it, and treatment and costs and all the rest of it, and kind of providing some kind of market report on, you know, how that evolves and changes, and maybe allowing insurers also to look more granularly at how their cover must change over time as well.
Yes.
So, sorry. So yeah, I think, I mean, that's my take on it. But so Fred Scott asks, what are the criteria for valuing artworks for insurance purposes?
So many policies nowadays, especially private collectors, are agreed value covers. So you will stipulate a sum insured upfront when you pay the premium. You tend to pay a slightly increased premium for agreed value coverage, because you have certainty of cover before the loss event occurs. And so for agreed value covers, and particularly higher value works, the underwriter would expect to see a valuation document before agreeing to insure, and that schedule of works insured on an agreed value basis would attach to the policy. So in the event of a claim, you don't have to prove value. That's already agreed between the parties. And so the biggest challenge, I suppose, in dealing with a claim would then be, in the event of there being a partial loss rather than a total loss, for you to be able to agree the diminution in value associated with the damage as giving rise to the loss event. So the policy will pay the cost of restoration plus any attendant loss of value. Loss of value is subjective. You could have 3 experts looking at the same piece of damaged art and they all come up with a different loss of value appraisal. But I think here again, in appraising diminution in value, the existence or otherwise of prior evidence of damage and restoration is particularly important. And this is where the value of condition reports comes into its own. Because if you have that condition report that draws a line in the sand and is absolute evidence of the state of the condition of the work before the loss event, it makes it an awful lot easier for you to then distinguish between the old and the new damage. And also, I think it's important to realize if you have a piece of art that is previously undamaged and in pristine condition, the impact of the fresh damage on that piece of art will be far greater than the impact of fresh damage on a piece of art that has a raft of pre-existing issues. So it's really a question of having a knowledge of the market for that art and how the opportunity of selling the art once restored would be influenced by its altered state. And I think the insurance industry and adjusters generally, in keeping with a lot of other people, they use databases, auction house databases, as a very useful tool in appraising value. They can look at similar sized and conceived works by the same artist to see what the trend in the market is. And the combination of the ability to refer to databases with your own knowledge that's built up over a period of years and the use of condition reports is usually sufficient for there to be meaningful, constructive and amicable discussions with claiming parties with a view to agreeing the loss of value head of claim. But it's not a science.
Right. It's more of an art, I guess. So there's, we should close out, but there's one last quick comment, which is to note that while the carbon footprint, Dale Cronkite is commenting that while the carbon footprint of sea freight is smaller, the nitrogen, sulfur, and pollution load is greater than almost any other transport system. And so that is a good point, Dale. I would mention that I know that, what are they called? Is it Mir2 or Mirco, the big shipping freight company? They are, they have committed, I know from presenting at COP26 that at that time they were committing to creating a fleet to accelerating their creation of their fleet of solar powered sea freight ships. So I believe that is coming soon. Maersk, thank you, Emma. Maersk. And I believe that is the company that anyway, Crozier have some relationship with, I know. I don't know about I'm sure other shippers do as well, but I think they're like the main player for sea freight that is used by fine art shippers, as far as I know. And so if again, and one of the other, I'll just close off also by mentioning that one of the other concerns that I've heard before is that we don't have enough oversight of the supply chain with sea compared with air and road, that's one of the key concerns. But it is in, using it more that we will gain that insight using documentation tools like our virtual courier, but also in just creating those relationships and having more of those relationships so that we have more of a say in how things are done, because at the moment there's so little sea freight that's used with art that we don't have much of a existing relationship with the purveyors of that supply chain. So anyway, that's an area that I think is under review and effort by some of the players in the art market. And as you say, Simon, there are also a lot of other areas that we can look at from the point of view of a carbon footprint reduction. And Hannah Andrews is saying, I have actually added a question regarding digital art. If we can take an extra 2 minutes. Let's see where. Can you tell us what the Pope Mobile is worth? Patricia wants to know. I want to know that too.
Well, the Pope mobiles that I actually saw, they ran from current day vehicles, but this is a few years ago now, back to and including the leather saddlery that was mounted on horses that were used before the combustion engine was even invented. So these are invaluable objects. So the figures are actually quite hypothetical, but very large. So I think the collection that I looked at was to be insured for something like 200 million, but it's an arbitrary figure because
Right,
items will never be sold.
right. And also can't be replaced particularly.
Yes, of course. Yes.
So Hannah's question I've just found at the top is, what about digital art? The nature of technology is that it is always evolving and can sometimes be unpredictable. If, for example, an interactive digital artwork that required a certain operating system to function, once loaned, stops being available to function due to an unforeseen update in software, i.e. becomes damaged in the eyes of the buyer or party receiving the loan, how can the loaner protect themselves? Good question, Hannah. I mean, I would just say before you get started, Simon, make sure that you are not using an operating system or something which is going to become defunct too quickly. I can say from a conservation point of view, I have looked into these at Tate. We had a world leading media, time-based media conservation department. And I have friends who were in that department, and we have had conversations about this very topic. And I know from the point of view of film, for example, Super 8 film and projectors that are very particular in some cases, like with I think Tacita Dean, you have the artist is insisting that you use this particular projector, and so you have to make sure as the institution that you have like 7. Anytime that projector comes up for sale, you have to go buy it quickly because it has to be that projector. You might also want to back it up by the film, backing it up digitally, looking at multiple formats in which you can have it available as an alternative to nothing, but also getting the artist to agree in a contract what is and is not okay from their point of view and acceptable in terms of how it's exhibited. So I was involved in the acquisitions and had to do interviews with artists about that very topic. So that's what I can say from a conservation point of view. Documentation, again, comes into play as being very important in this case. I'm thinking about how, in acquisitions and Tate, we had to say to ourselves, how will we display this thing in 100 years? How, and what does the artist find acceptable about how we will do that? And how do we also balance the artist's idea about what's acceptable for showing something or exhibiting it versus our idea as the owner of this piece? And, for example, the Tate's acquisition policy was not to collect ephemeral art because it wanted to be able to show things in 100 years. It did not want to just accept loss from inherent defects to the work. And another good example of that is the bread bed by Gormley. When the bread bed was donated to Tate, the only way that Tate would accept it was if they figured out a compromise of how to preserve it. And that compromise was to use wax in a kind of gaseous form to impregnate the bread with wax coating so that it could survive for much longer than bread would naturally survive, so that it could be exhibited in years to come.
Yes.
But that wasn't the original intention of the artist when he made it necessarily, but he was involved in the discussion and so was involved in the compromise.
Well, I think that's an important point in the context of works by still living artists. So we always with still living artists, in the event of a claim, adopt a collaborative approach. You're very unwise not to, given protection afforded to artists, for example, by VARA. Underwriters can, if they're not careful, have a very inconsequential partial loss claim that, if they do not involve the still living artist, can result in a piece of art becoming disavowed and becoming actually a constructive total loss due
Right.
to the artist not being involved. So it's always wise to work with still living artists. We had a claim recently involving an Italian artist, Morchetti, who produced a installation for a contemporary museum in Rome, involving a series of projectors that were built into some custom-made cases. They were damaged by water infiltrating the roof of the museum.
Mhm.
But the projectors, they were a total loss. They could not be restored, but we identified the manufacturers. Technology had evolved. Luckily, the artist was always motivated by avant-garde perspectives and considerations. And so we were able to liaise with the artist and say, well, this is the current technology available. Would you be willing to introduce this into the installation? And in fact, he was delighted to do that. It was a partial loss and a lot of money was saved. But I think going back to the comments about failure of technology, in the context of insurance, you will find, generally speaking, that policies will exclude loss or damage caused by, for example, electrical or mechanical breakdown. So if you have a piece of art that is interactive and it has an element that will inevitably degrade and expire over a period of time, at the point in time when it fails, you will find that that is usually excluded due to it either being a gradually operating cause, electrical or mechanical breakdown, or inherent vice.
Mm.
So accidental damage, yes, that would be covered. So in the previous example I gave, if you had damage by water or impact damage or fire or even a power surge resulting from a lightning strike, that would be covered. But an issue involving general to be expected degradation of an interactive object generally would not fall within the scope of cover of a policy.
Right. Well, that is good to be aware of. So thank you so much, Simon. I think we better close off because I'm conscious of the time and going over time. And I think you have a lecture to get to, right? Which is the whole reason we made this a little bit earlier. So I'm sorry for going.
I've got 15 minutes to
So we better
get ready.
definitely out. And thank you so much for a very interesting webinar. We really appreciate your agreeing to join us for this one. And thank you all that of you that have attended, and we will be getting the recording out soon. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Annika. Goodbye, everybody.
Cheers. Bye.